Ka tahuri atu tātou ki tēnei wahine. As the president and founder of Kauffman and Associates, Joanne Kauffman built the company from a one-woman shop into an organisation that now employs more than 50 people all over. Joanne is actively involved in all aspects of Kai operations and ensures that Kai clients receive high-quality management support. Haere tonu ana mahi katoa, ngā tau kua pahure. Joanne founded Kai in 1990. She holds a master's degree in public health from the University of California, and she was honoured by Business Beat as Minority Small Business Person of the Year in 2006, and as owner of the fastest growing minority business in 2004, 2007, and 2008. In 2015, she was awarded the Woman of Achievement Karl Maxey Racial and Social Justice Award. Joanne serves on the Board of Trustees at Eastern Washington University and leads Advisory Committee of the new Lucy Covington Centre at EWU. Please welcome to the stage, Joanne Kauffman.
Kia ora. Thank you. Honored guests and leaders and members of this organization, I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. In my language, it's Imakas Katsi Yao Yao. There's a large thank you to Tepu Tahitanga organization for inviting me here, and your invitation here honors me. And when I am honored, it is my obligation to give a gift because you've honored me. And so I would like to call Helen up, if you could come up on behalf of your organization to accept this gift from me and my people. Yes. Keep in your offices, and thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. So that was my important business that I needed to do to get started here today in a good way. And thank you for inviting me to this beautiful homelands, your home. I'm honored and humbled to be here with you and to be here as you celebrate your Indigenous entrepreneurial spirit together and tapping into that entrepreneurial spirit to improve your communities and to celebrate your beautiful way of being. We're all gathered here together to kind of sharpen our skills and get energized by the stories of innovation and bravery to move forward, to advance our dreams, and to set a sight for a new future for our people. And so I'm happy to be here with you. I'm going to talk a little bit about my journey as a Indigenous woman in the United States and the work that I do and the business that I've come to manage over these years, but more so to talk about my passion and to share those stories in hopes that it might provide some encouragement and support for your work and your passion in your communities. Before I get see if it's working here. Yeah. Hard. It's stuck. I didn't know I had that much gray hair on my head. So, is it not working? It just likes that picture. So I'm going to keep going because the next slide would have been a very brief animated slide that shows the history of the Americas. And I think you're probably already very familiar with the histories of the Americas, of the brutal expansion of the colonizing countries across the Americas and the very rapid impact of loss of lands among the American population, indigenous populations. I don't think we're going to do the animated version, but in the animated version, that blue color shows the occupation of indigenous lands by the colonizing forces, and over the course of a couple hundred years moves all the way across to the West Coast. And in that little yellow circle there at the far corner, that's my people there. That's the Nez Perce people. That's our lands as Nimiipuu people. And I'm sure you saw, as I did growing up, the Cowboys and Indians movies. And, you know, there's nothing crazier than little Indian kids rooting for cowboys or, you know, playing cowboys and Indians with each other. But, you know, the purpose of those movies and that way of storytelling was really to suggest that there was a benign progression of a superior society over a primitive people. And nothing could be further from the truth. The story that, you know, the story is really designed so that the beneficiaries, the descendants of those colonizers, can feel good about the benefits and privilege and comfort that that history afforded them. The real truth is much more unsettling. There are many estimates about the indigenous population. In just the continental United States, I've heard estimates between 10 and 20 million indigenous people at pre-contact, and over 50 million lost during the several hundred years after contact. In the United States, at the turn of the century, the 1900s, there were only 200,000 American Indians left in the continental United States. That was the lowest point. And then since 1900, the population has been slowly working its way back. So I wanted to figure out, you know, the term decimated. You heard that, you know, population was decimated. To be decimated means to wipe out 10%. It was the exact opposite with American Indians. The estimate was closer to 90% of the population that was wiped out. The United Nations, that was even before the United Nations had developed a definition of genocide. Their definition is that genocide is the denial of the right of existence of entire human groups, as homicide is the denial of the right to live of an individual human being. Such a denial of the right of existence shocks the conscience of mankind and is contrary to moral law and to the spirit and the aims of the United Nations. So that, you know, it's nice that we finally have a definition of that and that it's in the books. It's unfortunate it comes so many years after the genocide that happened not only in the Americas, but all across countries, including this one, where the colonizing forces were determined to eliminate the indigenous populations. A recent study by the University of London on the impact of the genocide in Americas on the global climate has indicated that the mass loss of life of 50 million people in the Western Hemisphere contributed to the little ice age that is on the records of the global existence that was a mystery for so many years that occurred between the 1400s and 1700s. So it was significant. It was significant losses for not, you know, in the context of community, but also in the context of global well-being. So I'm a member of the Nez Perce tribe. I live in the northwest part of the United States. And so as a tribe, our people enjoyed an expanse of territory that was used for gathering and foods and ceremonies. We were horse people, so we had could go all the way into what modern Montana area to hunt buffalo, and all the way to the west, closer to the coast, to the Celilo Falls, to fish. And the Celilo Falls was one of the largest economic centers in North America pre-contact. It was a huge falls where the salmon would gather as they would try to jump up and swim up past those falls and go on their journey back to their birthplace. And so tribes from all over the region would come together to fish and celebrate and discover, each other's goods and trades, make relationships, and just enjoy their time there at the Celilo Falls. In 1805, there was, as the United States expanded and purchased this big section of land from France, they sent Lewis and Clark out to explore what this new land was that they had just purchased. And so this big giant Louisiana purchase, that big pink section there. Lewis and Clark went all the way up out of St. Louis and went all the way over to the coast near Portland. And but they almost didn't make it. They actually they could have taken an easier route, but instead they decided to go up over the Bitterroot Mountains near Montana and nearly starved to death in the mountains as they did not know what to eat. And they came stumbling out into the village of my people in 1805. And at that time, they were near starvation. Their horses were near starvation as well. And our people had an important decision to make as they looked at these really kind of pitiful human beings that came stumbling out of the woods. Should we kill them? Because they had just packs and packs of ammunition, weapons, and we already knew about those, had heard about, seen those in action from the French explorers that had been through. Or should we help them? And it was a serious conversation that was happening. There was an elder who was there in the camp who years ago had been helped by some European people in her youth, and it was her advice to let them live and to help them. That decision was made to let them live. They were nursed back to health. They were provided fresh animals. They were sold boats and food and replenished their supplies. They were actually guided down to the Celilo Falls, to the base at bottom of the Columbia River, where it was just, not too much further to the ocean to their goal. So this was an economic exchange between the Nez Perce people and the Lewis and Clark expedition. There were things that were traded. There was a social and political bond that was made. I think for many people within the Nez Perce tribe, I'm sure it felt like a transformational kind of event that had happened. They had solidified a relationship with the incoming and vastly growing new race of people. Upon their return heading back east, Lewis and Clark stopped again and camped among the Nez Perce and stayed there longer with that tribe than with any other tribe, and waiting for the mountain snows to melt so they could make their way back to the east. They played games. They raced. I understand several babies were made, and it was a gathering of friendship. Yet, despite this very strong bond that existed, the Lewis and Clark expedition really was not a transformational relationship. It was a transactional relationship. And my tribe would later learn that lesson. And like every other tribe, it would suffer greatly as the United States expanded further westward, confining native traditional peoples into smaller and smaller circles of land that no longer included those important places for the gathering of foods and medicines and important places for the continuation of their culture and their beliefs. Later in 1855, our tribe and many other tribes in that area negotiated a treaty that would set aside our land so that it could not be infringed upon or encroached upon, as it was very obvious by that time that the westward expansion of the white settlers could not be turned away. The Treaty of 1855 enshrined 13 million acres, which is, you can see outlined in the yellow, for our people, and it covered all of our important lands. But again, this was a transactional relationship with the federal government. It was not a transformational one, because when gold was discovered later on, just a few short years after that treaty was signed, the federal government moved quickly to tear it up and to renegotiate one that did not include the vast majority of what we had negotiated. It dropped from 13 million acres to 700,000 acres, which it remains today. This left many of our people outside of that boundary. And because of the pressure that was placed on them to move on within the much smaller confines, war broke out, hostilities broke out, and the Nez Perce War of 1877 happened. And it was one of the last Indian wars. It was the very end of the Indian Wars. It was 1 year after Custer was killed at the Battle of at the Little Bighorn. The U.S. Army had been humiliated a year before in this great victory. And they were not going to allow any delays in moving the Nez Perce onto this smaller reservation. And so war broke out fairly quickly, beginning in June of 1877. The war split our tribe because there were people within our tribe who were inside of that smaller circle, and there were people who were outside of that smaller circle. The decision to fight or not fight, or to just move everybody into that smaller space and negotiate a peace was not ever finalized. It was really very much individual decisions within the many bands that existed. Leaving in its track, hard feelings that still exist generations later. The various chiefs that decided to fight banded together with all of the mostly women, children, and many horses, and made a retreat battle, winning every single battle, multiple battles, until they got into Montana, where they thought they had escaped and were in a completely different country. But Montana was, the telegraph was working. Other generals were telegraphed, and they were intercepted almost to Canada, where they were going to join up with Chief Sitting Bull and his people, and to be safe. 50 miles from the border of Canada, they stopped to rest. They were engaged by a different General Miles, and after several days, finally surrendered. Chief Joseph, who many of you may have seen his image, is probably the most famous, one of the most recognizable faces of Native leaders. He was the chief of his band, and he was the spokesperson for the Nez Perce who fought in the War of 1877, and even more importantly afterward, as he negotiated their eventual release from prison. But he was the last standing chief at the conclusion of that battle at Bear Paw Mountains. And I'm going to read you his final words when he did surrender. He said, "Tell General Howard I know his heart. What he told me before, I have in my heart. I am tired of fighting. Our chiefs are killed. Looking Glass is dead. Tuhulhulsot is dead. The old men are all gone. It is the young men who say yes or no. He who led the young men is dead. It is cold. We have no blankets. The little children are freezing to death. My people, some of them, have run away to the hills and have no blankets, no food. No one knows where they are, perhaps freezing to death. I want to have time to look for my children and see how many of them I can find. Maybe I shall find them among the dead. Hear me, my chiefs. I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." And with those words, he surrendered, and the Nez Perce, at least the ones that did not sneak out and escape to Canada, many of them did. Those remaining were placed on a train and sent to live in confinement in a completely different climate in the southern part of the United States called Oklahoma Territory. And it's interesting to note that one of those who was sent to live in a prison camp in Oklahoma was an old, elderly Nez Perce man by the name of Clark. So much for transactional bonds. During the 7 years of confinement as political prisoners, many died, and I learned that none of the babies that were born during those 7 years lived beyond their first year. And this year celebrates, or not celebrates, but commemorates the 142nd anniversary of the Nez Perce War of 1877. During the time when I was able to be a lobbyist for my tribe in Washington, D.C., I had the opportunity to work on a legislation that would recognize all the different battlefields and sites around that war of 1877. And it took us, the bill died twice before we finally got it enacted into law. As a part of that, we went to Oklahoma to see the cemetery of the Nez Perce who died in Oklahoma in their prison camp. And they shared that information that none of the babies born there survived. They did an honor song, and while they did the honor song, it was very quiet. You know, you could hear some birds in the background a little bit, but they did a song, and they asked the women to bring in the different flags to commemorate that. And as soon as the drum started and the song was being sung, it was complete silence except for one baby that one of the parents in attendance had brought with her. And the baby just wailed the entire time of the song until it was over. That was really, I think, to remind us what had happened at that place. So, I descend from bands, those that stayed and those that fought. Like many people in my tribe, we are all one. When Chief Joseph was returned and his people were returned, they were told that they could either, be placed up on the Colville Indian Reservation in several hundred miles to the north to be themselves, or if they would convert to Christianity, they could go back and live on the smaller Nez Perce reservation. So many of them, including Chief Joseph, were placed on the Colville Indian Reservation so that he could practice his own beliefs as he had since time immemorial, and he died there in as a young. He died in, I think, at the age of 50, and so as ancient as this sounds, it sounds like long time ago history. It's not that long ago. When I was a young girl on the Nez Perce Reservation, I was fortunate to be able to spend some time on the reservation with my grandparents who lived there, and who were able to show me the practices of our tribe and to engage in the hunting and fishing and gathering of roots and berries. But I remember that there were still survivors of the Nez Perce War who were still living at that time. So after the wars were over, that was the last big war. There was also a very large massacre that happened in 1890 that you probably heard of. But when the wars were over, then the assimilation effort began. The largest effort around the destruction effort to take away Native culture and to end those practices that were in conflict with European culture was the boarding schools. And I know that boarding schools are tools that have been used all around the globe to colonize the people. But this tool was used specifically to separate children from their parents and their culture and their language, ending the parent-child relationship, ending the opportunity to learn language and to practice important ways of their culture and beliefs. Many of the children that were sent to the boarding schools were targeted because of their connection to tribes that fought the U.S. government in many wars. Children forcibly taken were sent to live in residential schools. By 1900, there were 20,000 American Indians at boarding schools, and by 1926, there were 61,000 American Indians in boarding schools. They were severely punished. Their hair was cut. They were put into European clothing, punished for using their language. There were reports of physical and sexual abuse, and there was forced labor that is described. Many of the young children were tried to walk home. Some achieved that. Some died along the way. Some were captured and sent back to school. I went to go visit one of the larger schools is called the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, and I went to visit that school. It no longer functions as an Indian boarding school. It's on a military campus now. But when you first walk in there, the very first thing you see is a little cemetery with little white headstones. And you walk through there and you see the names of the little kids and the ages of those that did not return. And it's a very powerful, moving thing that happens when you walk into that place. My grandmother, Lizzie, she was born on the banks of the Clearwater River on the Nez Perce Reservation about a decade after the War of 1877, so it'd be 1887. And when she was a young girl, she was sent to the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania to be civilized. The motto over the school archway was "Kill the Indian, save the man," and that was the purpose. So, as a young student at Carlisle Indian School, she was taught to speak English, read and write in English, learn math calculations according to their methods. But the most important thing that they seemed to stress was cooking and cleaning, because she was farmed out on the weekends to tend houses of patrons of the school through each weekend and throughout the summers. By the time my grandmother passed away in 1971, she had witnessed and experienced just extraordinary changes. And I'm trying to think about 1971. So I graduated from high school in 1971. I thought I kind of, knew everything, very modern and, listened to the Beatles and, ready to go to college and all that stuff. But she, just thinking about what she experienced from that 10 years, when she was born, just after the War of 1877 to when she passed away in 1971. She bore 9 children through her life. She buried 6 of them. She saw the influx of the dominant white and hostile culture. She saw the systematic loss of lands and restrictions for access to gathering places up in the mountains. She saw the destruction of alcoholism on people that she loved. She could see, people who were strong-bodied, strong-willed, turn angry and unpredictable and lost, searching for something that they were unable to articulate. She vowed as a young child that she would never in her life touch alcohol. And she would, a fact she told me often, and over her 87 years, she never did. This is a picture of some of my sisters and me with my grandma and my grandfather, Katsa and Pilaka. As a young child, she embraced a belief system that was new to our people. She thoroughly embraced it and believed that the Son of God had come to earth and died, that she might live eternally. But she also, and she was proud of that and shared that and brought us all up in a Presbyterian faith. But she also watched and told stories to me and others about how the Christian missionaries of that time demanded that each and every native who converted to Christianity must dig a hole into the ground and bury their traditional items, the sacred items that they may have been passed down through their family, and bury them deep in the earth and cover them up so that those old ways would be no more. And which is think about the hurtful things, because so many of those things symbolized the resilience and the power of our worldviews and ways of knowing, and things that commemorate our coming of age and and collection of foods and medicines. All of that being buried in the ground and how that affects us today. She also saw in her 87 years the arrival of trains and motorized cars and electricity and indoor plumbing and telephones and televisions. But one of the things she also saw was the building of the hydroelectric dams along the Columbia River. One of those hydroelectric dams was built and silenced forever the Great Celilo Falls, the place that was the largest economic enterprise zone of North America pre-contact, was silenced once and for all. Toward her later years, she even watched in amazement, if not horror, as men walked on the moon. And I remember her watching it on television and seeing her angry and upset, because she was convinced that, that the white man had gone too far, that this act was such a violation of the grand order of things, that some great sacred celestial balance had forever been disturbed. Maybe she was right. I just wonder what she would say today, especially now as we face the climate crisis and the very survival of humanity. She and my grandfather were two of the most entrepreneurial people I have ever met. It's just been really encouraging for me to hear these different stories of entrepreneurship today. But I never knew two more entrepreneurial people as these two. They were always planning, they were always preparing and canning and preserving and anticipating and storing away the things that they were going to need for not just for themselves, but for their families and for guests, for somebody who drops in for a funeral that might have to happen. They were always trading or selling or bartering with other people who had other items that they might need, and they were always moving around. They were never still or idle. They were always busy. As a child, I observed both poverty and prosperity. So, and I realized that money really didn't have much to do with it. That was not, didn't seem to be the guiding factor behind poverty or prosperity. When my parents left the Nez Perce Reservation and moved to Seattle, Washington, I was 7 years old, and my father, who is not native, who's from a German mixed ancestry, he took a good job with the City Light company in Seattle. And then my mom, who is full-blood Nez Perce, took a variety of odd jobs, and from answering phones to waitressing to folding sheets at the basement of an old hotel. But they really struggled, and their struggles were not financial, they were emotional. As a couple, they struggled and turned to alcohol in a way that just brought chaos into our home, so that it appeared like we were poor. It appeared like we were poor because lights were often shut off, water was turned off, and there was no foods. We were barely getting by. But it wasn't because of a lack of money. It was because of lack of well-being and balance. Fortunately, at that time, my 6 other siblings and I were a little bit older and took care of each other. There was a strong urban Indian community in Seattle, probably much like Christchurch, where you have people who are not, there's not that tribe that's right there, but there's an urban Indian community, and they took care of us, and we got through that. And I'm happy to say that my parents also eventually found the balance and quiet in their lives that stayed with them through the rest of their lives. But we were fortunate that none of us were removed. That was the biggest fear that we had as children, is having the social service people come in and take us away, because we knew if we got taken out of the house, we would be put up for adoption, we'd be split up, we'd be put in foster homes, we would not be able to see each other again. And so that fear really kept us together and made us take care of each other. Many of our relatives were not as lucky, and we grew up hearing the stories of different ones that got adopted out and wondering where in California they might have been placed. But eventually, as they became adults, they found their way home and tracked down their blood relatives. But when I lived with my grandparents, it was a very different story. But they had very little money. I think they survived on Social Security checks, maybe some lease money. But they lived, to me, it appeared they lived in relative prosperity. They had a running car, and they had 3 meals, same time a day, every single day. And they were warm, safe, comfortable home, and they had loving, surrounded by, extended relatives, and a house that was filled with love, with music, with, spiritual well-being and prayer. And so from my view, I thought they were very prosperous. But if you went back in time and looked at their income, I'm sure that they were living under the index for poverty. But in practical terms, they were very rich because they were in a family of balance and wellness. So I learned that poverty and prosperity are not always related to money. But I wanted to know, as I grew older, why some people suffered and others prospered, and what's behind this determination of how people become healthy and how people become unhealthy, and why that is. In college, I pursued public health because I really it was a topic that fascinated me, to try to understand how populations became healthy and how they were prevented from disease. Public health, also the definition of health on the bigger scheme sounded very indigenous to me. I learned in public health that just having access to an outpatient clinic doesn't change your health status. It might relieve your ailment at that time, but health status is much bigger. It has to do with just everything, basically. Your community, your lifestyle, income is a factor as well. But the World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease and infirmity, which to me is very indigenous, because it's indigenous wellness is about restoring balance. Western medicine is about addressing sickness. And so if you're always addressing sickness is what gets the attention instead of wellness and well-being and balance and harmony. So one of the examples at the School of Public Health was, the classic public health example is, when you see bodies coming down a river, and the community responds by racing over there and pulling the bodies out of the river, and trying to resuscitate them. But a public health person will walk up the river upstream to find out what's happening. Why are their bodies being dropped in the river, and try to stop the source of the problem. And so that was that area that really fascinated me. And it was also something that was consistent with, indigenous knowledge on Turtle Island around the medicine wheel and the balance of the spiritual, physical, mental, and emotional aspects of our lives. And so being able to work in native communities in a way that acknowledged our wisdom to seek that balance across those four spectrums was something I pursued. I worked right after graduate school, setting up nurse practitioner clinics in northern Idaho that were designed to reduce infant mortality. And those clinics continue to this day. I also had the opportunity to work at the Seattle Indian Health Board as their CEO to provide a comprehensive primary care system that had everything from inpatient alcohol and drug treatment to outpatient medical, dental, and mental health services. But the most profound thing for me was to step away even from those direct patient care things and try to understand, again, as a public health person, what's further upstream. Why are we seeing increases in diabetes? Why are we seeing patients that are non-compliant with, hypertension or other health challenges? And so, as I investigated further, I learned more and more about the intergenerational impacts of historical trauma and substance abuse and violence, and how that impacts the ability of not just individuals but communities to achieve that indigenous definition of wellness and balance. So I have been involved with the Healing Our Spirit Worldwide. That's was my first trip to New Zealand was for the Hamilton Conference about 4 years ago. I met Manya's Auntie Jess at that gathering, and we remained friends. I've been working with the intergenerational effort at the University of Toronto and their Masters in Indigenous Healing and Indigenous Trauma and Resilience, training a new generation of Indigenous practitioners who are dedicated to healing and wellness. But it was in 1990 when I relocated to Washington, D.C., and I went there because my husband had taken a job with one of the U.S. senators. And that was the first time in my life I had moved someplace without knowing what I was going to be doing. And it was a little frightening, but I almost immediately I was asked to do some legislative lobbying for my tribe, for some of the Indian health organizations I had worked with. And so I began on a new adventure of social entrepreneurship. And social entrepreneurship is to draw upon business techniques and private sector approaches to find solutions to social, cultural, and environmental problems. So my company, Kauffman and Associates, has been in business for 29 years. We've been hired by tribes and intertribal organizations across the United States, and we do a lot of work for federal agencies and all of it addressing Indian country. As I heard this earlier this morning, it was nice to hear stories from other entrepreneurs, because one of the biggest tests for me was confidence. Having the confidence to put my name out on a shingle and say, I'm running my own business and this is what I do. It took me about two days of staring at my letterhead before I got brave enough to send it out and announce to everybody that I had this business. The second one was credit. I didn't have a lot of credit or a good credit score. I went to buy some equipment for my office, like a copier and a fax machine, because that's how you did it. You did fax machines in those days, and a computer and a printer. And I applied for credit at the Staples store, and they wrote it all down. They said, you can take the equipment. It'll take us a day or two to process your paperwork. So I had all my equipment set up in my brand new office, and I even had some clients visiting from a tribe in the Northwest when there came a knock at my office door, and it was two guys in these little jumpsuits, and they said, we're here to pick up the equipment because your credit was turned down. So it was kind of, I thought it was going to be an embarrassing catastrophe, but that day I had received a check in the mail for payment for previous work, and I was able to write the man a check at that time and just barely escape destruction of my new business. But I'm sure that, for entrepreneurs, there's always those little crisis moments when that happens. But I got through that. As my company grew, it grew to, our largest time was in 2011. We had 100 employees, and we were very busy. We have offices in Washington, D.C. and Seattle and Spokane. But a big part of the work for me was training up a workforce that really would represent me, would carry the same passion and values that I have about making a difference in communities, and would do that in a way that was high quality and within the budget that we had to operate. And just like my ancestors experienced, working with the federal government, there's no guarantees. It's not a transformational relationship. It's kind of transactional. When times change, policies change. And we've experienced that now with this new administration. We have fewer opportunities, but we're continuing to reach out to at the tribal level. We do a lot of planning with local governments, and have been given opportunities that where we can be transformational within our Native communities. So as you look to your opportunities, I think for me the ways to be transformational is to follow your passion. I followed my passion in public health, to hire talented Indigenous professionals to help you. Locate your business in communities where you're going to make a difference, even if it's not your own community, in a community where your presence will lift other people up. Integrate your Indigenous knowledge within your business practice. So our motto is we do work that matters. And so everybody is there to make a difference, to change communities for the better. Mentor, another advice is to mentor future leaders who share the passion that you have for social entrepreneurship, and invest in your own brilliance. Invest in your own brilliance. Too often we believe that we either need permission or somebody knows better. And I found that sometimes the hard way is that, you were right in the beginning. So trust your people, trust your own people, and trust your intuition. We had several opportunities. One of the opportunities I want to share with you is this horrible mass shooting that happened in a Minnesota reservation in 2005. And that happened about the same time as these suicide clusters that were happening in some other reservations. And we got a call from a federal official about we need a strategy for how to prevent this in other tribal communities. And so they called me up and called my company, and they said, send us a plan. And hung up the phone, and I thought, wow, this we need to talk to some elders, some folks who are healers in these communities. We consulted with a lot of folks, but in the end, what we came up with was a strategy for engaging local communities based on the principle that we don't have the answers. The answer is not going to come from on high, but we believe that the traditional knowledge, the cultural knowledge within each of the communities can be tapped to identify the strategies and solutions to the challenges that they face around alcoholism, substance abuse, violence, and suicide among their youth population. We started something called Native Aspirations. Over the years, we worked with 65 communities over 8 years, following this basic premise that all these communities would need is a facilitator to help them do the planning that they have, to help them plan what the solutions that they have within their communities. So it begins with the circle of relationships, their vision for the future, and their and the sense of hope. Some of the lessons learned, that they have the keys to their own wellness, and that all they need is support. That our communities are very much land-based, and the cultural resilience will come from their culture, their language, and their land, and that our purpose is really only engagement. Some of the strategies that they came up with was everything from equine therapy, reconnecting with their traditional practices around horses, to language revitalization, restorative justice practices and peacemaking, connecting elders and youth together, bringing back coming of age ceremonies for young people who come of age, but without having that ritual and instruction, restoring those, and bringing youth back into the decision-making circle, so that those youth councils would be able to help and provide advice. Another opportunity that we had to do with oral health, and this is one that we did with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. And this is one that you all were very instrumental in moving forward, because New Zealand was the beginning place of dental therapists, mid-level providers in dentistry. For the United States, dental therapists have not existed. It's been basically the dentist and some dental assistants and maybe some hygienists. But for our populations, there were not dentists who wanted to serve people in those remote locations. They did not want to serve poor people. They did not want to serve people who didn't have insurance. So the Kellogg Foundation asked us to look at how to take what Alaska had done by using New Zealand's model. It was working well in Alaska. How do we get that to the lower 48 states? So we've been working with them for the last 8 years to bring dental therapists into the lower 48. We've been successful. The Washington State Legislature and the New Mexico State Legislature have passed laws allowing that, but it's a slow climb, but we're making progress. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about remembering our past and where we come from. One of the pet projects that I have is with our local university to establish what we're calling the Lucy Covington Center. So I'll talk, Lucy Covington was a Colville tribal member, and back in the 50s, the federal government in the US had a policy called termination. They had two policies. One was called termination, one was called relocation. And they worked hand in hand. So relocation would go and recruit Native families off the reservation and place them in urban areas and support them for 6 months and then say, you go and assimilate, go forth and assimilate. And then termination was a policy that was designed to do that, terminate federal status. It just, with a stroke of a pen, you just don't exist as a tribe anymore. You're gone. You're just like everybody else. And there were many tribes in the 50s and 60s who were, in fact, terminated. And the way they would do it is they would go into the tribal community and they would promise large sums of cash to every single person in the tribe if they would vote, majority vote, to terminate. So many tribes, because of the poverty that they were facing, ended up terminating. Lucy Covington, when they came to her tribe, she started a campaign to stop termination. And she was an entrepreneur. She was a cattle, she raised cattle on her reservation. She was a rancher, but she sold her cows and bought airplane tickets and flew to Washington, D.C. Many times to lobby Congress and stop termination. So she lobbied her own people and got them to vote it down. And then they thought, okay, Lucy, are you happy now? And she said, no. So she flew to Washington, D.C. She lobbied Congress, the senators and the members of the House, and got them to stop the termination policy. So they finally ended that policy in the 1970s. And he thought, okay, Lucy, are you happy now? And she said, no. She continued. She sold more cows. She went back out to Washington, D.C. and lobbied to restore recognition to the hundreds of tribes that had been terminated. And so when they restored that recognition, she was happy. She passed away in the 1980s, and she was from Washington State, not too far from where I live in Spokane. She's from a different tribe, but she's somebody that everybody needs to know about. And when I moved to the Spokane area, I was surprised that not many, there was no like monuments or anything erected in her honor. And so right now I'm working with the Eastern Washington University to create a Lucy Covington Center that will memorialize not just her as a person, but the concept of social entrepreneurship and leadership development around personal action and personal initiative to create change in your community. And so I'm happy that's moving along. I just wanted to mention briefly also Standing Rock, because more and more of our information that we're receiving and that we're observing as people of this land is the environmental peril that our world faces right now. And more we're hearing about Indigenous voices and Indigenous knowledge holds promise for strategies for addressing the climate crisis. Just this morning on Facebook, I was supposed to be working on my remarks in PowerPoint, but I had to see what's going on Facebook and who's doing what do they got to say. But I was amazed that there were video after video of flooding on my home reservation as we had an unseasonable snowfall, and now it's warming up very quickly and it's raining. And so there's just a ton of video of people leaving their homes and not having enough sandbags, and just the impact, bridges getting washed out and highways getting cut under, and all of that goes along with flooding is very scary. And because of the rain, the mudslides and things that were happening. But the thing that's interesting, I mean, again, that happens from time to time, but this same community just a few years ago was ravaged by forest fires. So we are seeing the extremes, the extreme impacts of climate change, and Indigenous people, more than other folks, are going to be out on those front lines of climate change. So that's why it was very heartening to see the huge response at Standing Rock. And again, this was fed by social media a lot, because as we saw the chairman of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe getting arrested for trying to protect the water that fed his community, many tribes responded. I went out there twice. I went out there over the long Labor Day weekend, and then also in November. And the first time I was out there, there were 3,000 or 4,000 people camping, but they had discovered that there were grave sites, human remains, prehistoric grave sites, unmarked, that were in line of where that pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline, was going to go, carrying the oil, and then it was going to go under the river and back out the other side. Once those graves had been reported that weekend, the Dakota Access Pipeline hired folks to come in and bulldoze the entire area where the graves had been reported. It was astonishing to see. That was also the same weekend when the dogs were turned loose on the folks who were trying to stop them from bulldozing the graves. So, and then I went back again in November, and there were about 10,000 people there camped, and Indigenous people and non-Native people. But one of the things that was very heartening for me was walking through what had become a new village to help Standing Rock stop the oil pipeline. Was I came upon several groups of Maori people, and they were there in support of what was happening. They were there as relatives in this struggle of Indigenous survival and Indigenous knowledge. They were there to lift up everyone in song and prayer, and just to be fellow warriors in defense of Mother Earth. And I just want to say thank you. This morning when we got started, I also got to talk a little bit with Corbin. And this picture here was only taken about 2 weeks ago. And there was just a beautiful ceremony at the Celilo village. And so I've talked about Celilo Falls. So this is the village that remains there by the falls. So the falls was this great gathering place of many tribes, including my tribe. My sister is this last one here on the right. And when she heard I was coming down here, she wanted to make sure that I brought some gifts for Corbin and the two women that accompanied the human remains that had been taken off of an island in the middle of the Columbia River that was a traditional burial place, an ancient burial place, and some scavenger collectors were out there digging around, and somebody had dug up these human remains and had taken them back east. And apparently, many years ago, had corresponded with someone in Christchurch about trading those for some bird bones that the other person wanted. So they traded. So then those human remains ended up here in Christchurch. And going back, I forget, Corbin said, gosh, it was, did he say 1998? I think when the discussions began about how to get them back. And it took them a long time to get validate that these, in fact, were the bones from the Columbia River. Once all of that, and then the earthquake happened, and that kind of delayed things. But once that finally got settled, you all sent 3 people up to our country to return these human remains and do it in a way that was respectful, prayerful, honoring the journey and the spirit of this individual who was going home. And I just compare that, what happened at Standing Rock, with this bulldozers intentionally desecrating these grave sites, and the care and effort that you all showed to return the human remains back to the Columbia River. I'm just very grateful for all of you. So I just, I know that you all, we all share many, many stories, many experiences. We're very different, but in a lot of ways we're very, very alike. I know that I stand on the shoulders of many others who came before me, and my ancestors, my grandma who struggled, who went to Carlisle Indian School. I know I stand on the shoulders of women like Lucy Covington and other folks, other descendants of the wars, descendants of the boarding schools, and you all as well stand on the shoulders of your ancestors and share beautiful stories about them. And including, non-Indigenous ancestors like my father. But, we all know that, that your ancestors were the first people to step foot on this beautiful land, and that your feet, when they walk on this land as Indigenous people, are caressed more lovingly. And I encourage us all to embrace our stories and share our stories, because our stories, that's the medicine. Their stories are the medicine that gets us through our shared journey ahead. And as social entrepreneurs, we're at the cutting edge of our future, especially all the young folks who are here. That, your work is going to be the bridges that get built between new technology and ancient wisdom. And, it's going to change not only your families and communities, but you might be the ones to discover the things that need to happen to save Mother Earth and all humanity. So I want to say to the young people to reject transactional relationships and to embrace the transformational relationships, because that's what's Indigenous about our entrepreneurship. That's what makes us different kinds of entrepreneurs, that we have that transformational relationship and commitment to social impact. As we, Chief Joseph said, the earth is my mother. And I know that, how we would take care of our mother, how we would take care of our mother's grave, should be our relationship with Mother Earth. So you all young folks are going to be looking at the digital revolution and faster and faster computers and robotics and artificial intelligence and all of the things that we heard about, and I hope that you will put all of that to work for our Mother Earth. Because right now we're just watching our Earth become more polluted. We're watching the alarming rise of white nationalism and more outspoken racist views, more destructive intent. We see also people turning in hope toward Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous ways and practice. And how can we navigate this, not to overshare and dilute what we have and what we know, but how to bring along the greater society so that we can really learn how to live in harmony and balance. What are those ancient teachings that are going to, that have sustained us, since time immemorial? What are those that can help all people into the future? How are we going to assess those lessons? So you, my young folks in the audience, you are hope. You are the thought leaders and the inventors and the innovators. You're the peacemakers and the teachers, but more important, you're the truth tellers that are going to lead us into the future. So being a business owner or a business person does not place you outside that circle of caring for your communities, not at all. Indeed, we are the ones who have the freedom to dream big and to be entrepreneurial in making our communities better and to invest in communities in a way that might be sustainable. And so there's nothing more Indigenous than exercising your personal sovereignty to be entrepreneurial. It's my hope that you will leave this place better and that you will fly like eagles and see the future and beyond our horizons and take your rightful place as the two-legged steward of this world, not as anything superior, but as a brother to the other parts of the creation, to treat it with respect and a sense of responsibility for all living things, and to bring back that sacred balance of this beautiful creation, our Mother Earth, for the next 7 generations. So I want to say Amakas Katsiyaoyao to you. Thank you for inviting me here. Thank you for being so committed to your communities and your future. Katsiyaoyao.